Hey guys, tonight we're not just listening to a story. We're stepping back into a world where every peal, every chime, every frantic clang from a towering campanile in medieval Italy held the very breath of life and death, of joy and despair. In its echoing vibrations, imagine, if you will, a city where time isn't measured by the gentle sweep of a clock's hand on your wrist, but by the colossal bronze voices high above, dictating your waking, working, and sleeping. You're a baker, perhaps kneading dough by the pale dawn light, and the morning bell tells you it's truly time to open your shop, not just your eyes. Or you're a tired merchant haggling over silks in the piazza, and a sudden, sharp, insistent ringing sends a shiver down your spine. Is it fire? An invasion? A riot? You probably won't survive this era without a finely tuned ear for the subtle nuances of bell speak. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of medieval Italian city bells, and indeed bells across much of Europe, doesn't begin with a sudden ding from a grand campanile. Oh no, their lineage stretches back into the hazy mists of antiquity, far beyond the cobbled streets of Florence or Venice. You see, long before the first Christian basilicas dotted the landscape, simpler bells were already part of human experience. We're talking about small, often crude, metal vessels used by ancient Egyptians for religious rituals, by the Chinese for musical instruments, and even by Romans to announce the opening of public baths or the arrival of a fishmonger. Think of them more like glorified cowbells than the mighty bronze giants we'll soon discuss. These early incarnations were utilitarian, functional, often quite humble. But then, as Christianity began to spread its roots across the crumbling Roman Empire, something shifted. Early Christian communities, meeting in secret catacombs or modest house churches, adopted bells, albeit slowly at first. They weren't for grand announcements to the wider populace, but for more intimate, internal functions. Imagine a small, handheld bell, perhaps no bigger than your fist, rung quietly to call a dispersed congregation to prayer or to mark the elevation of the Eucharist during a clandestine Mass. It was a subtle signal, whispered summons, in a world that was often hostile to their faith. This practice, initially born out of necessity and discretion, gradually evolved. As Christianity moved from persecuted sect to state religion, its architectural ambitions grew. No longer confined to hidden spaces, churches began to rise, reaching for the heavens. And with these soaring structures came the need for a more powerful voice, a sound that could carry across nascent urban landscapes and rural fields. The very first church bells, as we might recognize them, were not hung in monumental towers, but rather from simple wooden belfries, or even just suspended from sturdy tree branches near a humble chapel. They were often small, forged from hammered iron sheets rather than cast bronze, and produced a rather clunky, resonant sound. But their purpose was profound: to gather the faithful, to mark the liturgical hours, and to differentiate sacred time from secular time. This was a revolutionary concept in a world where time was largely dictated by the sun's arc or the grumbling of your stomach. A bell, even a small one, introduced a new communal rhythm. It was a tangible, audible connection to a shared spiritual life, a continuous thread of sound weaving through the daily grind. Historians still argue whether the earliest widespread use of church bells was primarily for monastic communities who needed precise hourly signals for their rigorous prayer schedules, or if it was a more general adoption by parish churches, responding to the growing populations of early medieval settlements. What is certain, however, is that this seemingly simple invention, a hollow piece of metal struck to make a sound, was about to transform the very fabric of urban existence in ways its earliest proponents could never have imagined. It was a technological leap, yes, but more importantly, a social one, providing a new, ubiquitous soundtrack to life. As the early medieval period blossomed into the high Middle Ages, especially in the burgeoning city-states of Italy. The humble bell underwent a magnificent transformation. It wasn't enough for them to hang from a wooden post anymore. They needed a stage, a monumental structure to project their voice across ever-growing urban landscapes. And so, the campanile rose. You know those iconic bell towers that punctuate the skylines of Italian cities, standing proudly next to their cathedrals and churches? These weren't just architectural flourishes. They were instruments of power, identity, and profound civic function. Imagine you're walking through the narrow, winding streets of a 12th century Italian city, say Siena or Florence. Buildings are packed tightly, reaching upwards, and then suddenly you emerge into a piazza. Your gaze is immediately drawn upwards, not just to the dome of the Duomo, but to the impossibly tall, often ornate bell tower beside it. These structures became focal points, visible from miles around, signaling the very presence and prestige of the city. They were expressions of civic pride and fierce independence. Each city vied to have the tallest, most elaborate, most resonant campanile. It was an architectural arms race, if you will, but instead of missiles, they were launching bronze voices into the sky. The construction of these campaniles was a monumental undertaking. Think about it. No modern cranes, no steel scaffolding. It was all about brute force, ingenious pulley systems, and the tireless labor of countless masons, carpenters, and laborers. You'd see teams of oxen hauling immense stone blocks, master. Builders poring over intricate plans, and workers toiling away, sometimes for decades, to see these giants rise. And rise they did, piece by painstaking piece, often incorporating defensive features into their design, because in the tumultuous world of medieval Italy, a bell tower could also serve as a watchtower, a last bastion of defense in times of siege. Some campaniles even had battlements at their top, reminding everyone that while they might call you to prayer, they could also call you to arms. But beyond their sheer physical presence, the urban impact of these campaniles was transformative. Before them, a city's soundscape was primarily human, the clamor of the market, the cries of vendors, the clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones. The campanile introduced a new, dominant acoustic layer. Its bells, once hoisted into their lofty chambers, literally defined the sound of the city. Their voices became the constant background hum, the reliable punctuation mark for every passing hour, every significant event. You couldn't escape them, and you wouldn't want to. They were the heartbeat of the community, unifying its inhabitants under a shared sonic experience. It wasn't just about hearing a bell. It was about belonging to the city that rang it. Historians still debate the exact interplay between ecclesiastical and civic authority in the construction and control of these towers. Were they primarily church property, serving spiritual functions? Or were they increasingly seen as symbols of the commune's power, with secular authorities dictating their use? The truth, as often is the case, is likely a blend of both, evolving. Over time, in many ways, the campanile became a battleground, sometimes literally, for who held the true reins of power within the city walls. And for the ordinary citizen, looking up at that towering structure, it was a constant, majestic reminder that while life might be hard, there was something grander, something unifying, perpetually sounding above them. You'd often hear people refer to their city by the sound of its main bell, like the city of the Great Bell, adding another layer of auditory identity to their already fiercely proud local allegiances. It was a time when your city's bell was probably more famous than any celebrity you can think of today. Now, imagine a world before your smartphone, before the grandfather clock in the hall, even before the humble hourglass was a common sight. How did people know what time it was? You might think, well, the sun, obviously, and you'd be right to an extent. Sundials existed and were certainly useful on a clear day. But try telling the time accurately by a sundial when it's pouring rain or pitch black outside. Or even more challenging, try coordinating an entire city's activities market openings, guild meetings, church services, the locking of city gates based on everyone's individual interpretation of the sun's position. It was a bit like trying to run a symphony orchestra, where everyone just sort of guesses when to play their notes. Chaos. Delightful chaos, perhaps, but chaos nonetheless. Enter the bells. With the rise of the campanile, these mighty bronze voices took on a revolutionary new role. They became the city's public clock. This wasn't just about telling people. It was roughly midday. It was about establishing a standardized, communal rhythm for an entire urban population. For the first time, everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful merchant, heard the same signal at the same moment. The concept of synchronized timekeeping, which we take completely for granted today, was a profound innovation, largely driven by the pervasive sound of the bells. This standardization of time had massive implications for medieval society. Think about trade. Merchants could now agree on precise times for market openings and closings, facilitating smoother commerce. Guilds could coordinate their work, ensuring that apprentices arrived on time and that collective tasks were completed efficiently. Religious life, of course, was deeply intertwined, with bells calling the faithful to daily mass and prayer, reinforcing the church's central role in society. But it wasn't just about convenience. It was about control and order. The city authorities, by controlling the bells, effectively controlled the pace of urban life. They decided when the gates opened and closed, when curfews were enforced, and when the working day began and ended. It was an early form of urban planning, co-strated by sound. A quirky tidbit here: sometimes the city's main bell, often called the campana majori, or great bell, would be so vital that it was given a name, imbued with a personality, and even revered almost like a patron saint. La Grassa in Bologna, La Mariana in Venice. These weren't just lumps of metal. They were living voices of the city, beloved and depended upon. Historians still debate the exact moment or mechanism by which this shift from informal, sun-based time to bell-standardized time became widespread across Italian cities. Was it a gradual organic adoption, or were there specific decrees from powerful communes enforcing these new rhythms? What is clear is that the campanile and its bells fundamentally altered the human perception and experience of time, pulling it from the abstract realm of celestial bodies into the tangible, audible reality of daily urban life. It really puts a new spin on time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? Because in medieval Italy, time flew at the precise cadence of a very large, very loud bronze bell. So, you've now got these magnificent campaniles standing tall, their bells acting as the city's universal clock, but their utility extended far beyond mere timekeeping. The daily life of a medieval Italian city, from the crack of dawn to the hush of night, was a symphony orchestrated by these bronze voices. Every chime, every peal, every distinct sequence of rings had a specific, universally understood purpose. It was creating an auditory tapestry that wove together the lives of every citizen. It was like living inside a giant, slightly anxious musical box. Let's start your day. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky, a particular bell would begin its toll. This wasn't just wake up. This was the Ave Maria bell, calling the faithful to their first prayers of the day, signaling the start of prime. For the baker, it meant lighting the oven. For the farmer just outside the walls, it meant harnessing the ox. For you, perhaps it was the signal to finally roll out of your straw mattress, grumbling slightly about the early hour. As the morning progressed, other bells would chime. The market bell was a critical one. Its distinctive pattern, often a series of rapid, urgent rings, would announce the official opening of the piazza for trade. Imagine the scramble. Merchants would rush to unveil their wares. Farmers would jostle for the best spots. Citizens with wicker baskets would emerge from their homes, eager to secure the freshest produce. This bell wasn't just a signal, it was an invitation too. The vibrant, chaotic heart of urban commerce. Then there were the work bells. Guilds, those powerful associations of craftsmen, often had their own bells or designated tolls from a communal tower. These would signal the beginning and end of the working day for specific trades. The wool workers, the shoemakers, the goldsmiths. Each might have a unique call. It was a rigorous schedule enforced by the persistent clang from above, and woe betide the apprentice who lingered too long over his breakfast and missed the master weaver's bell. You'd probably find yourself scrubbing pots, or worse, banished to the dreaded dungeon of lost socks. Beyond the secular, the sacred was, of course, omnipresent. Throughout the day, bells would ring for the various canonical hours terce, sext, none, vespers, compline calling devout citizens to prayer, even if just for a moment of quiet reflection. Amidst the hustle and bustle, these were slower, more deliberate tolls, a stark contrast to the urgent calls of the marketplace, a sonic anchor in an often turbulent world. A quirky tidbit. Some cities had specific funeral bells with a particularly mournful, slow, and deep tolling pattern, instantly recognizable as a signal of death and mourning. These bells could communicate profound sorrow across the entire city, drawing attention to a passing, reminding everyone of the fragility of life. Historians still debate the degree to which these varied bell signals were universally understood across all social strata, or if certain signals were more relevant to specific segments of the population, like merchants or clergy. Regardless, the sheer complexity of the bell language meant that to be a functioning citizen in a medieval Italian city, you had to be fluent in its auditory lexicon. Your ears were your most important timekeeping device and your daily planner, all rolled into one. It was truly the original smart home system. Just, it's much louder and powered by a guy pulling a rope, while many bells orchestrated the gentle rhythms of daily life, the market opening, the call to prayer, the end of a workday. There was another class of bell, far more potent and terrifying, the alarm bells. These weren't mere signals. They were piercing screams, desperate cries for help echoing across the rooftops, instantly plunging an entire city into a state of heightened anxiety, if not outright panic. When these bells rang, you didn't just listen. Your heart would pound. Your stomach would clench. You'd instantly scan the horizon for signs of the unfolding catastrophe. Imagine you're enjoying a quiet evening meal with your family. Suddenly, a single, sharp, insistent clang shatters the peace. Then another and another, and not the measured rhythm of the hour bell, nor the joyful peals of a festival. This is a frantic, irregular, relentless clamor, unlike any other. This is the fire bell. You'd drop your spoon, perhaps overturning your bowl of pottage, and race to the window, or even out into the street. The pattern was typically rapid, discordant, meant to convey immediate and dire emergency. Smoke on the horizon? A glow in the night sky? These bells confirmed your worst fears, galvanizing an entire populace into a desperate, often disorganized response. Everyone was expected to drop what they were doing and assist, forming bucket brigades, pulling down houses to create fire breaks, or simply fleeing. Be lucky if your house wasn't made of straw. Frankly, even more chilling were the bells that signaled the arrival of plague or other widespread diseases. These were often not sharp, sudden alarms, but rather a slow, mournful, almost relentless tolling, especially if it was the death cart bell moving through the streets. Imagine the dread. A bell that didn't just announce a problem, but announced death itself, approaching your door. It was a sound that forced you indoors, compelled you to bar your windows, left you praying for salvation while holding a handkerchief soaked in vinegar to your nose. Sometimes, cities would cease all but essential bell ringing during severe plagues, as the constant tolling for the dead became too overwhelming, a grim soundtrack to mass mortality. Historians still debate the psychological impact of these constant death knells on the population during major outbreaks. Did it galvanize them to action, or simply deepen the despair? It probably depended on how full your bucket of optimism was that day. Then there was the famine bell. While perhaps less dramatic than the sudden clang of fire, it's long drawn out. Increasingly frequent tolls spoke of a creeping, insidious dread. The failure of crops, the scarcity of food, the specter of starvation. These bells might call people to public granaries, where meager rations were distributed, or to communal prayers for divine intervention. They were a sound of desperation, a grim reminder of how fragile life was, entirely dependent on the whims of weather and the success of the harvest. You'd likely see more gaunt faces and desperate eyes with each passing day. These bells rang. The terrifying power of these alarm bells lay not just in their volume, but in their ability to instantaneously transform the entire collective mood of a city. One moment, peaceful. The next, gripped by terror. They were the original emergency broadcast system, only louder, more visceral, and delivered without the soothing tones of a news anchor. For the medieval Italian citizen, these were the sounds that kept them perpetually on edge, constant reminder of how close calamity always lurked. It's just a bell toll away. If the fire bell sent shivers down your spine and the plague bell chilled you to the bone, then the bells of war were a whole different beast. These weren't just about fear. They were about galvanizing an entire populace, whether for defense, attack, or the desperate final stand. In the fiercely independent and often warring city-states of medieval Italy, the sound of war bells was a common, if always terrifying, part of life. You'd know, almost instinctively, that when these bells rang, the stakes were suddenly unimaginably high. Imagine you're a young craftsman, perhaps a blacksmith, hammering away at your forge. The clang of your tools echoing in the air. Suddenly a new clang cuts through, deeper, more resonant, and with a rapid, regular rhythm that raises the hairs on the back of your neck. It's the rally bell. This wasn't just a call to arms. It was the city's urgent plea for every able-bodied man to gather, to defend the walls, to form a militia. You'd drop your hammer, wipe the soot from your face, and rush to the designated muster point, grabbing whatever weapon you had, a rusty sword, a sturdy spear, even just a sharpened farming tool. These bells were the original Avengers Assemble. But with less spandex and more genuine existential dread, then came the bells that signaled an impending siege. These might be a series of short, sharp, repeated bursts, perhaps from different bells within the city, confirming the grim reality that an enemy army was at the gates, visible on the horizon. The sound would send citizens scrambling, rushing to bring their livestock inside, pulling up bridges, bolstering defenses, and preparing for the grim, drawn-out ordeal of a siege. It was a sound that meant rationing, fear, and the constant threat of assault. The continuous, heavy toll of these bells during an active siege would serve as a grim soundtrack to the city's struggle, a constant reminder of the peril. Historians still debate the specific variations in bell codes used by different cities to distinguish various levels of invasion threat. It was a single sustained peal for a distant sighting, and a rapid, continuous clang for an imminent attack. The subtlety was likely vital, and when a siege was finally broken or a battle won, the bells would shift again. Imagine the joyous, cacophonous pealing of all the bells in the city, the church bells, the civic bells, even smaller, private bells ringing. Out in a glorious, uncontrolled symphony of victory, it was a sound of relief, of euphoria, a collective sigh of survival after intense peril. People would pour into the streets, weeping, cheering, embracing, the sound washing over them like a cleansing wave. This was the moment when the bells didn't just announce, they celebrated alongside you. Conversely, the grim toll of bells could also announce defeat. A slow, mournful, almost hesitant tolling, perhaps just from one or two bells, would tell the tale of a lost battle, the fall of a city, or the death of a beloved leader. It was a sound of collective grief and despair, a public lament that hung, heavy in the air, informing everyone of the bitter taste of loss. Sometimes after a devastating defeat, bells might even be deliberately silenced for a period, a symbol of humiliation or mourning. It was a stark reminder that these bronze voices weren't just objects. They were deeply intertwined with the emotional and political pulse of the city, capable of conveying the highest joys and the deepest sorrows of its people. So, next time you hear a bell, spare a thought for the medieval citizen, whose life literally depended on understanding its every nuanced tone. While the bells often brought news of anxiety, peril, or the strict rhythms of daily life, they also held a profound capacity for joy and celebration. Imagine a medieval city, often beset by hardship. Sudden bursts of festivity were cherished and amplified. And what better way to amplify joy than with the glorious, unrestrained clamor of 1,000 pounds of bronze ringing out from the heavens? When it came to ceremony and celebration, the bells weren't just background noise. They were the very heart of the festivity, a soundtrack to collective delight. Think of a religious festival, perhaps the feast day of the city's patron saint. From early morning, the bells would begin a joyful, insistent pealing. Not the hurried, sharp alarm of fire, but a full, rich, continuous carillon, a joyous cascade of sound that permeated every corner of the city. You'd see citizens donning their finest clothes, houses decorated with colorful banners and garlands, and the air thick with the scent of roasted meats and sweet wine. The bells would call you to grand processions, where relics were paraded through. The streets, accompanied by chanting monks and devout citizens, all moving to the rhythm of the celebratory chimes. It was a communal act of faith and jubilation, utterly inseparable from its magnificent soundtrack. Weddings were another prime occasion for bell ringing. Not every wedding, perhaps, but certainly those of wealthy merchants, noble families, or especially the marriage of a prominent civic leader. Imagine the bride, resplendent in her finest gown, walking towards the church, accompanied by her family and friends. As she approached, the church bells would erupt in a joyful, slightly erratic peal, signaling the union to the entire city. It was a public declaration of love, lineage, and alliance, announced with such fanfare that even your grumpy neighbor couldn't ignore it. It added a layer of grandeur and communal participation to what we now consider a largely private event. And then there were the great civic celebrations. The signing of a peace treaty, the triumphant return of a victorious army, the successful completion of a major public work like a new fountain or city wall.
Ow!
For these moments, every bell in the city, from the grandest campanile to the smallest chapel bell, would be unleashed in a glorious, uncoordinated symphony. The sound would be deafening, exhilarating, a physical manifestation of collective relief and pride. Imagine the sheer exhilaration of a city united in joy, their cheers mixing with the booming, ringing, echoing sound from above. It was a sound that made your chest swell with pride for your city, your people. You'd probably forget all about that horrible cough you'd had for 3 weeks, a quirky tidbit. During some particularly grand festivals, it wasn't uncommon for bell ringers to compete in demonstrating their skill, producing intricate melodic patterns or extraordinarily long, sustained peals, further adding to the festive atmosphere. Historians still debate the extent to which these celebratory bell sounds varied from city to city, reflecting regional customs or the specific character of their major festivals. What is certain, however, is that these were moments when the anxiety induced by daily and alarm bells was swept away, replaced by pure, unadulterated public joy, amplified 1,000-fold by the resounding, triumphant voices in the sky. It was truly a case of, if you can't hear the bells, you're not having enough fun. You've heard how the bells shaped daily life, announced crises, and amplified celebrations. But have you ever stopped to wonder how these magnificent, booming instruments were actually made? It wasn't just a matter of digging up some metal and banging it into shape. The creation of a medieval city bell was an incredibly complex, labor-intensive, and often dangerous undertaking, requiring immense skill, precise knowledge, and a fair bit of whispered prayer. This was the domain of the bellmaker, a highly specialized artisan whose craft combined metallurgy, engineering, and even a touch of alchemy. The process began long before the roar of the furnace. First, the bellmaker, often assisted by skilled draftsmen, had to meticulously design the bell. This involved not just its size and shape, but crucially, its desired note and tone. Think about it. A bell's sound isn't just random. Its pitch, its timbre, its sustained. These are all determined by its precise dimensions, the thickness of its walls, and the specific alloy of its metal. Medieval bellmakers understood these principles through generations of empirical knowledge, passed down often within families. They knew exactly how a bell should be proportioned to produce a powerful, resonant sound that could carry across a bustling city. It was a bit like trying to perfectly tune a giant bronze instrument before it even existed. Then came the materials. The primary component was bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, but not just any bronze. The proportions were critical. It's too much copper and the bell would sound dull. It's too much tin and it would be brittle and prone to cracking. It's this exact recipe. It was often a closely guarded secret, a trade mystery passed from master to apprentice. To obtain these metals, vast quantities of raw copper and tin had to be mined and transported, sometimes from far-flung regions, then purified, often through multiple laborious smelting processes. This alone was a massive logistical challenge. Once the design and materials were ready, the actual casting process would begin. This involved creating a complex mold. Typically, a bell was cast using a false bell technique. A core of brick and clay would be built to the bell's internal shape. Over this, layers of wax and clay would be applied to form the exact external shape of the bell, including any inscriptions or decorations. This was the false bell. Then a final outer layer, or cope, of clay would be built around this. Once the cope was dry, the entire assembly would be heated, melting the wax false bell and leaving a hollow space between the core and the cope, perfectly shaped for the molten bronze. This part of the process required immense precision. Any flaw in the mold would result in a ruined bell. The grand finale was the pour. This was a truly dramatic event, often witnessed by civic dignitaries, clergy, and curious citizens. A massive furnace, heated to scorching temperatures, would hold the molten bronze, glowing a fiery orange. The signal from the master bellmaker, the sluice gate would be opened, and the incandescent metal would flow into the waiting mold. Often buried in a pit to prevent spillage and retain heat, the air would crackle with heat, the ground would tremble, and a collective gasp would go through the crowd. This was the moment of truth. Many bells cracked during cooling or emerged flawed. A successful pour was a cause for immense celebration, often accompanied by feasts and blessings. It was like giving birth to a giant metallic child after a very long and uncertain pregnancy. Historians still debate the specific secret ingredients or techniques, such as the addition of silver, that some bell makers were rumored to use to achieve exceptionally pure or resonant tones. Was it true? Or just clever marketing? After cooling, the bell would be carefully unearthed, cleaned, and then crucially tuned. This was often done by chipping away tiny amounts of metal from the inside or rim to achieve the desired pitch. It was a delicate, skilled operation. One wrong chip could ruin months of work. The bell maker wasn't just a craftsman. They were an artist, a scientist, and a bit of a magician, bringing forth the voice of the city from earth and fire. It's no wonder they were so revered, and probably a bit stressed. So, we've got these magnificent bells, born of fire and intricate design, installed in towering campaniles, dictating the rhythm of life, death, and celebration. But for the medieval mind, particularly in an era steeped in faith and folklore, bells were far more than mere timekeepers or alarm systems. They were imbued with mystical properties, considered sacred objects capable of influencing the unseen world. This was the realm where sound and superstition intertwined, giving bells a power that stretched beyond their audible range. Think about the very act of blessing a bell. This wasn't a casual ceremony. Bells, especially large church bells, underwent elaborate consecration rituals, often involving holy water, incense, and anointing with sacred oils, much like a baptism. They were often given names, sometimes after saints, and were considered to have a spiritual essence. The belief was that once blessed, the bell's sound itself became sanctified, capable of warding off evil spirits, chasing away demons, and purifying the air. So, when those bells tolled for daily prayers, they weren't just calling you to church. They were also casting a protective sonic shield over the entire city. It was like an ancient, high-tech anti-demon sound system, powered by holiness. Perhaps the most widespread and fascinating superstition concerned bells' ability to influence weather. Imagine a violent thunderstorm raging, lightning splitting. The sky, hail pounding the rooftops. The fear was palpable. Many medieval communities believed that the furious clanging of church bells, particularly those that had been properly blessed, could dispel thunder, scatter hail clouds, and even prevent lightning strikes. Bell ringers would frantically pull their ropes during storms, often at great personal risk, convinced they were literally battling the elements with sound. Tragically, many ringers were indeed struck by lightning while performing this perilous duty, a grim testament to their unwavering faith in the bell's power. You can imagine the conversation. "Don't worry, Bartholomew, the bell will save us." Oh, wait. Bells were also believed to have protective qualities against plague and disease. The constant ringing during an epidemic, beyond signaling deaths, was also intended to literally purify the air, driving away the invisible miasma believed to cause sickness. While we now know this was ineffective against bacteria and viruses, for the medieval citizen, it was a desperate communal act of resistance against an unseen enemy, a sonic prayer for health. The louder and more continuous the ringing, the more potent its perceived effect. A quirky tidbit. Some bells were thought to have the power to reveal hidden truths, or even predict the future. Legends might tell of a bell that would only ring spontaneously when a true king passed by, or that would peal a specific rhythm if a disaster was imminent. These weren't mainstream beliefs, but they illustrate the deep reverence and almost magical properties attributed to these sonorous objects. Historians still argue whether the belief in bells' supernatural powers was a genuine, deeply held conviction by all, or if it was encouraged by the church and civic authorities to reinforce their own power and control over the populace. What is undeniable is that, for the medieval Italian, the sound of a bell was never just a physical vibration. It was a potent force, resonating with spiritual meaning and carrying the weight of centuries of belief. It truly was the original good vibes-only machine, if those good vibes came with a side of divine intervention. If the bells were the voice of the city, then who controlled that voice became a fundamental question of power and politics. In the tumultuous, fiercely independent city-states of medieval Italy, where civic pride often clashed with ecclesiastical authority and noble factions vied for dominance, the ownership and use of bells were not just logistical concerns. They were highly charged symbols of who truly held the reins of power. To control the bells was, in many ways, to control the city's pulse, its narratives, its very sense of identity. Historically, the church often laid claim to the bells, considering them sacred instruments integral to religious life. They were used to call the faithful to prayer, mark feast days, and announce divine services. The campanile, often attached to the main cathedral, was undoubtedly ecclesiastical property. However, as Italian communes grew in wealth and independence, civic authorities began to challenge this monopoly. They recognized the immense power of the bells to communicate with the populace, to rally militias, to announce market times, and to enforce curfews. Why should the bishop alone decide when the city gates were opened, or when citizens should assemble? This led to frequent conflicts and disputes over bell control. Imagine a standoff. The bishop insists a bell should only ring for the Angelus, while the city council demands it also ring to summon an emergency assembly. Sometimes cities would build entirely separate civic towers, like the Palazzo della Signoria in Florence with its Arnolfo Tower. It's distinct from the Duomo's campanile specifically. Two house bells controlled solely by the commune. This physical separation of bell towers was a powerful architectural statement of the commune's independence and its assertion of secular authority. It was like saying, "We'll have our own loudspeaker, thank you very much." The ability to ring. The great civic bell, often called the Parliament bell or the Council bell, was a profound symbol of sovereignty. It was the sound that summoned the city's governing bodies to crucial meetings, that ratified new laws, or that declared war. If a rival faction or an invading army seized control of a city, one of their first acts would often be to silence or take control of the main bells, dismantling this potent symbol of the deposed power. It was a clear message. We are now the ones pulling the strings, and the ropes. A quirky tidbit, in some extreme cases of political upheaval, bells would even be melted down and recast by the victorious faction, not just to make new bells, but to erase the very sound and identity of the previous regime. The bronze itself held a sort of historical memory. Historians still debate the extent to which these political battles over bells reflected genuine ideological clashes between church and state, or if they were primarily pragmatic struggles for control over vital urban infrastructure and communication. What is undeniable is that the sound of a city's bells became inextricably linked to its political fortunes. The way the bells rang or didn't ring told the story of who ruled, who fought, and who ultimately held sway over the anxious, vibrant heart of the medieval Italian city. It makes modern political rallies seem pretty quiet, doesn't it? Beyond the grand political and spiritual pronouncements, medieval Italian city bells also played a crucial, often subtle role in the intricate world of guilds and trade. These weren't just about calling a market open. They were about regulating commerce, ensuring fair play, providing a standardized system for the complex economic engine of the city. For the ordinary merchant, artisan, or consumer, the specific tolls from certain bells were as important as any written contract, dictating the very flow of goods and money. Imagine you're a wool merchant, eager to sell your finest cloth. You wouldn't just set up your stall whenever you pleased. You'd wait for the distinct, rhythmic chime of the merchant's bell or the market opening bell. This bell, often rung from a tower overlooking the main piazza, signaled the official start of trading hours. For its first toll, no transactions were permitted. This ensured that all merchants had an equal opportunity to set up and that buyers arrived simultaneously, preventing unfair advantages. It was the medieval equivalent of the stock market opening bell, only significantly louder and with more sheep. Similarly, there were bells that specifically regulated specific trades. The weaver's bell might signal when the weaver's guild hall was open for receiving raw wool or delivering finished cloth. The fisherman's bell could announce the arrival of fresh catches at the fish market, causing a sudden rush of eager buyers. These distinct signals helped organize the flow of goods, preventing hoarding and ensuring that supply and demand met efficiently. It created a highly structured, auditory ecosystem for commerce. A particularly interesting application was the use of bells to announce public auctions or the arrival of valuable, rare goods. Imagine a ship pulling into port, laden with exotic spices from the east, or a caravan arriving with precious silks, special, perhaps longer and more elaborate. Series of tolls might announce the availability of these high-value items, drawing a more select crowd of wealthy merchants and discerning buyers. This was like the original flash sale notification, delivered via a very large, very loud, bronze push notification. Quirky tidbit. Some city-states even had bells that would signal the closing of money-lending establishments or the official hours for debt collection, adding another layer of auditory regulation to the financial sector. Historians still debate the extent to which these bell-based regulations were truly effective in preventing fraud or price gouging, especially in the absence of widespread literacy. What is clear, however, is that the bells served as a crucial, universally understood medium for enforcing economic order and transparency in a pre-modern world. They were the original economic indicators, booming forth the health or sometimes the anxieties of the city's commercial heart. You learned to read the bells, not just for time, but for profit too. While the bells themselves were magnificent, booming instruments, their voices were entirely dependent on the often-sung heroes and sometimes comical villains who made them ring, the bell ringers. These weren't just random people pulling on ropes. They were a distinct, often highly skilled, and sometimes rather unruly, part of medieval city life. The act of bell ringing was far from a simple task. It was physically demanding, often dangerous, and required a surprising degree of precision and coordination. Imagine yourself in the belfry of a towering campanile, hundreds of feet above the bustling city streets. Around you hang colossal bronze bells, some weighing many tons, their clappers ready to strike. You, the bell ringer, stand before thick, rough hemp ropes that disappear upwards, connecting to the massive bells. To make these giants swing and produce their magnificent sound, you didn't just tug. You had to use your whole body, throwing your weight into the pull, often swinging with the rope to gain momentum. It was less like pulling a switch and more like wrestling a very large bronze beast. The floor might be slick with dust and grime. The air, thick with the smell of old rope and ancient wood. The sheer volume of the bells, when they struck, would reverberate through your very bones. You'd probably need ear protection, which, surprise, surprise, they didn't have. So, a fair few bell ringers likely ended up with, shall we say, a robust appreciation for quiet moments. The skill involved was immense, to produce the precise rhythms and sequences needed for market openings, curfew, or even complex ceremonial carillons. Bell ringers had to be highly trained. They worked as a team, especially for multiple bells, coordinating their pulls to create harmonious or specific alarm patterns. It was a bit like a medieval drumline, only with much heavier instruments and far greater consequence if you missed a beat. Some bell-ringing guilds even developed intricate codes and signals among themselves. It's a sort of secret language of the ropes, to ensure perfect synchronization. But being a bell ringer wasn't all about solemn duty and skilled artistry. There was a distinctly human and sometimes rather unruly element to it. Bell ringers often enjoyed a certain notoriety, perhaps due to their elevated position literally above the city, or the sheer power they wielded over its soundscape. They were sometimes known for their drinking habits, their boisterous nature, or even their occasional use of the bells for unauthorized personal messages. Imagine the city hearing a bizarre, unscheduled peal, only to realize it was just Bartholomew the Ringer announcing he'd finally found his lost cat. Historians still debate how strictly these bell ringers were monitored and disciplined by civic and ecclesiastical authorities. Were they rogue agents or mostly reliable civil servants? It likely varied wildly from city to city and from day to day, depending on how much wine Bartholomew had consumed. And then there was the danger. Beyond the risk of lightning strikes during storms, bell ringers faced constant hazards, getting tangled in ropes, falling from the belfry, or being crushed by a rogue bell. It was not a job for the faint of heart, or indeed the clumsy. Yet, for all its challenges, it was a vital role, connecting the grand, silent structures of the campanile to the vibrant, anxious, and celebratory lives of the medieval citizens below. The unruly ringer, in all his sweaty, rope-burned glory, was truly the unsung voice of the city. Not all silence is peaceful. In the world of medieval Italian city bells, the absence of sound could be just as potent, and often far more ominous, than any clamor. There were times when bells were deliberately silenced as a form of protest, as a grim punishment, or as a sign of profound ecclesiastical displeasure. When the voice of the city fell quiet, it was rarely a good sign, leaving the anxious citizens to wonder what new hardship or conflict had arrived. Imagine a city simmering with discontent. Perhaps the ruling council has imposed a new, unpopular tax, or a powerful noble family has committed an egregious injustice. As a form of peaceful or not-so-peaceful protest, citizens might demand the silencing of the city's bells. The idea was to create an eerie, unnatural quiet, a tangible expression of the city's collective sorrow, anger, or mourning. This wasn't a sudden chaotic silencing, but a deliberate act of withholding the familiar sounds that ordered daily life. The lack of the morning market bell, the absence of the midday work chime, this would have been profoundly unsettling, a palpable disruption to the very rhythm of existence. It was like the city holding its breath, waiting. You'd probably find yourself subconsciously checking your non-existent watch, only to be met with uncomfortable silence. Then there was the far more severe punishment of having your bells silenced by external authority, particularly by the church. This was known as an interdict. An interdict was a powerful ecclesiastical censure that deprived a city, region, or even an entire country of most sacraments and liturgical rites. The ultimate sign of an interdict was the silencing of all church bells, no joyous peals for festivals, no comforting calls to prayer, no mournful tolls for the dead. Imagine the psychological impact. A city suddenly cut off from its spiritual lifeline, its daily life stripped of its familiar sacred soundtrack. It was believed to bring divine displeasure, perhaps even plague or famine, upon the community. This was a direct assault on the collective soul of the city, and the silence was its chilling manifestation. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of interdicts enforcing political compliance. Did it work by genuinely terrifying the populace into submission, or by creating such social and economic disruption that rulers were forced to concede? Either way, it was a very effective way to make a point. Bells could also be silenced as a direct consequence of military defeat or conquest. As we touched upon earlier, an invading army might explicitly order the main bells to be silenced, or even taken down and carried away as spoils of war, as a definitive statement of their dominion. This wasn't just about controlling communication. It was about stripping the city of its voice, its identity, and its pride. The absence of its familiar sound would have been a constant, humiliating reminder of subjugation. A quirky tidbit. In some instances, when a city was in deep mourning, not just for a person, but for a profound loss like a devastating fire, all bells might be muffled with cloth, so their sound became a dull thud rather than a clear peal, sonic embodiment of profound grief. So whether by protest, punishment, or conquest, the silence of the bells was a potent, anxiety-inducing phenomenon in medieval Italy. It transformed the vibrant soundscape of the city into a stark, unsettling quiet, a powerful testament to the fact that sometimes what you don't hear speaks the loudest. It was literally the sound of quiet quitting, but for an entire city. As the High Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, especially in the vibrant intellectual and artistic centers of Italy, the role of those magnificent city bells began to subtly but undeniably change. They didn't vanish, of course, there. Still ringing in Italian cities today, but their supreme authority over time and daily life started to be challenged by a new, revolutionary technology, the mechanical clock. This wasn't a sudden death knell for bells, rather a slow, graceful evolution, shift in the way time itself was perceived and precisely measured. Imagine the wonder, and perhaps a touch of suspicion, with which the first mechanical clocks were viewed. These were intricate contraptions of gears, weights, and escapements, initially installed in the very same bell towers, sometimes alongside the existing bells. For the first time, time was being measured not by human effort or the sun's arc, but by a precise, unceasing internal mechanism. Early mechanical clocks didn't have faces with hands like we know them. They often struck a bell to indicate the hour, sometimes with a miniature automaton figure emerging to strike it. So paradoxically, the clock still relied on the bell for its public voice. It was like a new, nerdy friend who was still a little shy and needed the loud, extroverted bell to communicate. The advent of mechanical clocks brought a new level of precision to timekeeping that bells, reliant on human bell ringers, simply couldn't match. No longer was midday a rough approximation based on a series of chimes. It became a precise point, marked to the minute. This shift had profound implications for society. For merchants, contracts could be drawn up with greater exactitude. Scholars, astronomical observations, and scientific experiments could be timed with unprecedented accuracy. The concept of efficiency began to gain new meaning, as activities could be planned and executed with a level of synchronicity previously impossible, however. Historians still argue whether the initial spread of mechanical clocks was driven primarily by practical necessity, the need for more precise time in commerce and navigation, or by the intellectual curiosity and human fascination with ingenious machinery characteristic of the Renaissance. It was probably a delightful mix of, oh, this is useful, and ooh, shiny. Even as clocks proliferated, bells retained their social and symbolic power. They continued to be the voice of celebration, alarm, and communal identity. A clock could tell you it was noon, but it couldn't ring a triumphant peal for a victory, or a mournful toll for the dead with the same emotional resonance. Bells, with their deep historical roots and their connection to human effort and tradition, continued to embody the soul of the city in a way that the cold, impersonal gears of a clock never could. They became less about granular timekeeping and more about announcing significant events, preserving their ceremonial and alarm functions. While the clocks handled the minute-by-minute grind, it was a graceful handover, allowing bells to lean into their big-picture role. You might say they retired from hourly management to become grand public announcers, so, as you drift off, let's consider the lasting resonance of those medieval Italian city bells. Even with the rise of mechanical clocks, and eventually, the digital devices that now govern our lives. The grand campaniles and their bronze voices never truly faded into obsolescence. They evolved, certainly, but their deep, resounding echo continues to be an integral part of Italian urban identity. A living link to a past where every chime held profound meaning. Today, when you wander through the cobbled streets of Florence, Siena, or Venice, you'll still hear them. The bells from the Duomo, the civic towers, the smaller churches, they still mark the hours, though now it's often in conjunction with a precise mechanical clock. But listen closely. It's more than just telling time. That grand evening peal, perhaps the Ave Maria bell, still calls to mind centuries of devotion. The joyous, almost chaotic, ringing during a festival like Siena's Palio or Venice's Carnival still evokes the collective euphoria of past celebrations. And while we no longer live in fear of the fire bell, it's distinct. Urgent clang during a test or a drill still carries a vestige of its ancient power to command attention. The legacy isn't just auditory, it's deeply cultural and architectural. The campanile remains an iconic symbol of Italian cities, instantly recognizable. Standing testament to generations of craftsmanship and civic pride, they represent the collective memory of a people there, triumphs, their tragedies, and their daily lives, all woven into the very stone and bronze of these magnificent structures. Historians continue to study how the specific bell cultures of individual cities shape their unique identities, creating a soundscape as distinct as their architecture or dialect. Was the bell of Florence particularly assertive, reflecting its mercantile power? Was the bell of Venice more melodic, echoing its maritime heritage? We can only imagine the subtle nuances. A quirky tidbit. Many of these ancient bells are still the original ones, having survived centuries of war, fire, and political upheaval. They are living artifacts, their vibrations literally connecting you to the very same sounds that medieval citizens heard. Imagine that! The very same molecules in the air, vibrating the same way they did for a baker in the 13th century. It's a physical link across time, a continuous, unbroken chain of sound. So the next time you find yourself in an ancient Italian city, and the majestic sound of its bells washes over you, close your eyes for a moment. Forget your modern distractions. Imagine the medieval citizen whose life was utterly governed by those very same sounds. Feel the anxiety, the relief, the joy, the fear. Understand that for centuries, these magnificent bronze voices were the beating heart of the city, keeping everyone slightly anxious. Yes, but also utterly connected, utterly informed, and utterly alive within their shared, sonically defined world. Their resonance lingers, a beautiful, powerful echo through the ages, reminding us of a time when the loudest voice in town was a colossal piece of metal, expertly struck, dictating the very rhythm of existence.